According to Catholic theology and tradition, Jesus had many disciples, but only some of those were apostles. Those he called to spread his teachings, preach the gospel, and establish the church. Catholics consider the 12 disciples, Peter, James, John, and the rest, to be the first apostles.
But the original 12 aren't the only apostles. After Judas betrayed Jesus and he died by suicide, the remaining 11 chose Matthias to replace him, making Matthias an apostle. Later, Paul becomes an apostle as well. And tradition holds that Mary Magdalene was the apostle to the apostles, since she was the first to bring the good news of the resurrection to the men who were hiding for fear of the authorities.
Apostolic succession is one of the bases for the Catholic tradition restricting the priesthood to men only. Basically, the idea that ordained priests are the successors to the apostles. But since Mary Magdalene has long been viewed as an apostle, this complicates the discussion just a bit. And it opens an intriguing question. If Mary Magdalene was an apostle, might other women have been apostles also?
And if Mary Magdalene was an apostle, what about Mary of Nazareth, Jesus' own mother? Mary might not have preached Jesus' teachings to crowds or spread the news of his resurrection, but we see her proclaiming the glory of God in the Magnificat, guiding Jesus to perform his first miracle, and sticking with him by the cross, along with Mary Magdalene and the other women.
And she literally brought Jesus' body and blood into the world. We call Jesus the Word of God, from the Greek word logos. So even if Mary didn't preach the Word, she birthed the Word. Does that mean that she, too, should be considered an apostle? That's what we're going to discuss today on the third and final installment of our 3-part season finale on Mary.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
So, Emily, I have kind of mixed feelings on this whole topic of whether Mary should be considered an apostle. I think I know which side I might come down on, but it just brings up so many different, intriguing theological threads. What do you think?
Well, so before I answer this question, as I was rushing around getting ready to sit down at the desk for this podcast, I remembered something that Don Clemmer, who's a frequent contributor, collaborator with us, he sent me once, which is this website of all of the bishops, and it has all their biographical information and how old they are and where they come from, but it also has their supposed apostolic succession way back to biblical time, which I find I don't know how seriously I know to take that, but I do think it says something about the true importance of apostolic succession and who the apostles were and who gets to be an apostle, because it is something that the church has based its entire hierarchy on, right? And so if we're thinking about it that way, why not count Mary as one of the apostles, right? We know she was one of the only women at Pentecost, that she was in that group that was sent out to preach the gospel. She, like you said in the introduction, literally birthed the word of God, bringing it into the world. Why don't we get to count her as an apostle and expand our definition of what it means beyond this kind of genealogy that we normally use it for in the church? Like, what would it mean to look at apostolicity or whatever that word is, right? Like, what does it mean to look at that broader than just this genealogy and what it means in the church? And then if by that definition, maybe she is an apostle. So yeah, I guess that's where I kind of landed on it.
So that's interesting because I'm kind of coming at it from a slightly different perspective here, which is that, and like you, I have some questions about the accuracy of that particular lineage, just knowing how difficult it is to keep records. But I kind of feel like we've established that there's this very narrow group of people who are apostles, and that's special. And I almost want to kind of I don't know, break down the boundary between being an apostle and a non-apostle. And so I almost feel like viewing Mary as extremely important, viewing Mary as a figure for leadership, an icon, imaging women's leadership and women's ability to bring Jesus' body and blood into the world. I kind of feel like it might be more interesting and disruptive to leave her outside of that category of apostles.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I just keep thinking about, if we think about the apostles as the people who built the church, like who gets left out of that? And I know like we're supposed to consider Mary Magdalene an apostle to the apostles, but like we don't, first of all. And second of all, is there a way to consider more than like one woman as having built the church?
So I think that's a really interesting point you brought up, that we call Mary Magdalene the apostle to the apostles, yet then we're like, haha, but not really. Um, and it reminds me of a lot of the discourse around the women's diaconate, where we're like, yeah, yeah, there were women deacons, but not really. And, or even some of the conversation we have about being baptized priest, prophet, and king. And it seems like we're making words work two different ways depending on how we want to use them. And sometimes we're being very Catholic, and part of being Catholic is using these words with the full strength of their meaning. Like we literally believe that Jesus is present, body and blood, in the Eucharist. But then other times we kind of like step back and we're like, well, we're just going to make it be symbolic here. And it seems like we're really missing out on a lot of fascinating theology when we don't look at Mary Magdalene's status as an apostle with that full Catholic sacramental understanding, and we tiptoe around it a bit. But again, does that answer the question of whether Mary, the mother of Jesus, was an apostle? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Glad You Asked. Mary's relationship to Jesus, personally, biologically, theologically, does that qualify her to be considered an apostle? I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss, one of your hosts for Glad You Asked.
And I'm Emily Santa. Before we get to the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors. Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org. Now back to the question of the day. Was Mary an apostle?
So, Emily wasn't able to join us for our conversation with today's guest, but on this episode of the podcast, I had the chance to talk with theologian Natalia Imperatori-Lee, whose scholarship focuses on ecclesiology, feminist theologies, and Latinx theologies. She has written in both academic and popular publications on topics ranging from the Church's mistreatment of women scholars, on the perils of complementarity, and on Mariology. She teaches on Vatican II, sexuality and the sacred, and women in Western religion.
Imperatori-Lee has served on the board of the Catholic Theological Society of America and of the Academy of Catholic Theologians of the U.S. Her most recent book, Women in the Church, published in 2024 by Paulist Press, is an overview of feminist theology for the undergraduate classroom.
Natalia, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca. This is really great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. We should probably start out by clarifying, what is an apostle and how is being an apostle different from being a disciple? And then why is this distinction especially significant for Catholics talking about women in the Gospels?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. An apostle and a disciple are two different roles in the earliest church communities. Apostle is from apostolos, and it means one who is sent. So it's someone who is sent to preach the good news. The disciple is a different role altogether. A disciple is a follower, a student, a learner, an apprentice, someone who was near Jesus. It's pretty widely accepted that women and men were among Jesus's disciples. Sometimes we confuse, in regular church, right? Like not in theological circles, but regular pews. Some people will use apostle and disciple interchangeably, or maybe just set the apostles apart by saying the 12. And the 12 is a kind of symbolic thing in the Gospels, and all of those are men. But the group of disciples is widely accepted to include men and women, just people who hung out with Jesus, right? People who were Jesus's friends. The distinction is important because Mary Magdalene, in particular, is someone we recognize as not just a disciple, of Jesus, but one of Jesus's closest friends. And because all four of the Gospels mention her as the first witness to the resurrection and as someone who shares the news of the resurrection with the others of Jesus's closest friends, many people in the church call her the apostle to the apostles. So that was a big change. And sort of recognizing that Mary Magdalene has this role opens up questions about women's leadership in the church.
So yeah, when I was doing some reading just to prepare for this conversation, every time I Googled, was Mary an apostle, what I got was Mary Magdalene. And it just didn't seem like people were having this conversation as much. So luckily we are.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to disappoint you early, but I don't know that it's helpful to think of Mary, Jesus's mother, as an apostle. I think it's kind of important that we recognize a wide diversity of roles for men and women in the earliest churches, because I think that that keeps open the possibility that there's a wide diversity of ways to have leadership and important decision-making power in the church today. Not everyone has to be an apostle. Some people can be a Theotokos. Well, one person can be a Theotokos. Who am I kidding? So yeah, I think Mary Magdalene's role as an apostle is widely believed and pretty well sourced. I mean, it's tough to argue with it. I think if you're arguing with it, you're probably coming with some ideological bent, a desire not to see it. But Mary, Jesus's mother, is a trickier question. So it's I'm glad we're exploring it.
Is there any kind of a teaching or a tradition in the church suggesting that Mary, the mother of Jesus, might have been an apostle? Any language about that around her?
Not really. We know that she was important in the early church. She's depicted at Pentecost, named at Pentecost, one of the few women, maybe the only woman who is named as being in the upper room at Pentecost. So that makes her an important figure in the early church because she survives in that memory. But never as an apostle per se. I think that we can probably speculate about, does she receive the good news at the Annunciation? Does she, in a very physical sense, deliver the good news at Christmas? Maybe. I don't know. I feel very ambiguous about that. But certainly there isn't a lot of sort of tradition about Mary being an apostle, nothing really written about that.
So we're being kind of revolutionary here.
I don't mind that.
So looking at Mary's relationship with Jesus, her first relationship with him was maternal. She was pregnant. She birthed him. She nourished him. What's the theological significance of this, and could it potentially connect with any sort of ideas about her being an apostle?
Well, I think that Mary's motherhood of Jesus is something that we can locate, yes, in her physicality, and that's an important part, but also in the collaboration of Mary, a regular person, the collaboration of a regular person in bringing about the reign of God. I think if there are ways in which, for example, in my own prayer life, I like to think about Mary's pregnancy and Mary's giving birth and Mary's nourishing of Jesus as this sort of intimacy with God. And I can relate to it because I was lucky enough to be able to bear children and nourish them. And so it does give me a sense of closeness. And I think I have a poster, it's a print actually up in my office of a woman nursing a baby. And it says, "Take and eat, this is my body," right? And that I do find fruitful for my own spiritual life. I think if we sort of extrapolate that into kind of church questions or contemporary church governance, it's a bit of a problem because, like everything about the Bible, right? We know so little about it. We're so far removed from the world of first century Palestine. And I use this story with my students, right? Like, I think it's like a tweet that I saw or something, but there's some meme on the internet that was debating whether apple-bottom jeans, boots with the fur meant that the boots had fur or that the woman was wearing a fur coat. And again, if we can't get straight a rap song that was super popular 20 years ago, the likelihood that we're going to really understand the nuances of the Gospels is very, very slim. So we can't read 100% into it. Every time we're reading the Gospel and applying it to our contemporary lives like that, it's more about our contemporary lives than it is about what happened in Jesus's time. Having said that, I think it's cool. It's cool to think about Mary giving birth to Jesus. It's cool to think about Mary nourishing Jesus with her body. It's cool to think about the demands of motherhood that are physical, but also spiritual and emotional and last well beyond pregnancy and childbirth and into child rearing, right? That work, right? That very real labor as a kind of collaboration in bringing about God's reign. Is that apostolicity? I think if we conceive it very, very broadly, yes. In that all of us are called to collaborate in bringing about God's reign. But the fact that Mary got pregnant or that pregnancy sort of gives her a leg up in the apostolicity, I don't think is where we want to locate her influence in Jesus's life.
So yeah, kind of along that line of discourse. So do we have any information? I mean, obviously, what the Gospels gives us is fairly slim, but do we have any information or tradition suggesting that Jesus's teachings were due to what Mary, his mom, taught him to care about, and taught him to believe? And what would that mean for how we think about her role in relation to Jesus?
See, this is where I think Mary is actually quite powerful in the Gospels because the author of Luke decides to put the Magnificat in her voice. And that is some of the most explicitly political, explicitly, to use your word, revolutionary writing in the Gospel is, and it is in her voice. I think it says something that the author of Luke really wanted Mary to set that tone for the ministry of Jesus. It says something that Mary is saying, cast down the mighty, send the rich away, that sort of thing. Because it tells us, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to think that young children spent a lot of time around their mothers. And, if she was saying it before he was born, likely that she was saying it afterwards too, right? So that's where the work of her motherhood, I think, is more significant, right? I think our contemporary understandings of motherhood and the reason why motherhood is so fraught right now with women wanting to have it all and blah, 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 is because we underestimate the labor associated with the long game of motherhood, right? Yes, pregnancy is difficult. It's especially difficult that not all women can get pregnant, not all women can stay pregnant, et cetera. That is tough. And childbirth is tough and painful and it changes your body and dangerous. And I don't have to tell you this, you have kids too. But there's the part that doesn't necessarily, I mean, I certainly didn't feel like a mother after those things. I feel like a mother after these 20 years of really kind of working to keep a kid out of danger, working to sort of see that they're good, productive, empathetic, kind people, working to see that they, are functioning in the world around them in ways that are healthy. That is the harder work of motherhood. And I think we overlook that when we focus too much on Mary's pregnancy. And I think it makes invisible a lot of the other work that mothers are doing in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's like we've really kind of pared away so much of motherhood until it's just boiled down to this reproductive capacity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And like this abstract capacity that women have and not a real thing that real women really do. Some of them without giving birth, many of them mother without giving birth. And so I think it's important to see the Magnificat as a moment where, at least for the author of Luke, Mary's views and Mary's way of being in the world is a precursor for Jesus's way of being in the world.
So let's talk about her relationship with Jesus as he became an adult, which is also something that gets, I think, left out of conversations about motherhood, that mothers have friendships and relationships and parenting relationships with adult children. The Gospels show Mary as present in some key moments in Jesus' life and ministry. Does this tell us anything about her relationship with him at that point?
Yeah, so I can identify, like, we don't see a ton of Mary in the Gospels because they're not about her, they're about Jesus. But there are some key moments, as you said. So there's like the wedding at Cana, where Mary is, a great mom. She's really seeing, I've always related to Mary as an anxious mom because I'm an anxious mom. So she's at this wedding, she's sensing the sort of worry of the hosts, and she feels like she can do something about it through her son. And so she sort of, I don't want to say she coerces Jesus into that first miracle, but she certainly suggests it forcefully. And we've all been there with our kids making forceful suggestions. So she suggests forcefully that he step in and do something to help alleviate this situation. That tells me that they had a pretty close relationship, that it wasn't the sort of thing that she gives birth to him and then maybe has him under her wing until he gets lost in Jerusalem in the temple. And then he belongs to God and no longer to Mary, right? At Cana, we see that Jesus and his mother still have a relationship into his adulthood. So that's one moment. Another moment that I think also appeals to my anxious heart is in the 3rd chapter of Mark, where Mary and Jesus's brothers, whatever that means, are outside wanting to bring him home because they're worried that he's insane, or they're worried that he is, sort of gone beyond the pale. And so, anxious for his safety and his health, they go. And Jesus doesn't really kind of diss them, but a little bit does diss them, saying, who is my mother and my brothers and sisters? Anyone who does the will of God is mother and brother and sister to me. So he's not going with them, it seems. But again, you have that relationship of care, that relationship of concern, where Jesus doesn't only belong to this divine sphere. Jesus very much belongs to his human family as well. And I think that our devotion to Jesus as God, as the incarnation, tempts us to remove him from that familial grounding. But, it's heretical to do that because Jesus was a person and all people are grounded in human relationships.
I think that's a great point, emphasizing her concern for him there. I could totally see myself being like, "Oh my gosh, you're going to get yourself arrested," and then
Right?
and then having to deal with the fact that her kid is an adult.
Please don't do anything that's going to get you in major government trouble.
So, moving on then, to the early church era, what does Scripture show us about her role, Mary's role at that time?
Scripture doesn't say a whole lot. Scripture shows us little glimpses of Mary. Like we said, she's obviously major player in Jesus's infancy, a bit player in his adolescence, in that moment of being lost at the temple. Some cameos throughout. You've got Cana, you've got this, please come home with us before you get arrested. And then we know that she witnesses his torture / death at the hands of the state. And then we see her again at Pentecost. So there is this kind of accompaniment throughout Jesus's life and through the beginning, the earliest kind of seeds of the church. But that's really all that we see. We don't hear much from Mary after the wedding at Cana. And so we're left to our own kind of devices in terms of devotion and things like that. But we don't really see much of her.
So, something that I should probably circle back to is this image of Mary at the cross watching her child be tortured to death by the state. And, I think we do highlight often that the women were the ones who stayed and the men all ran away. what's the significance of Mary in that horrible moment for her, and what does that show us about her role in relation to the church?
Well, I think it's foundationally significant. And it's important, just theologically, that somebody witnesses that Jesus really dies. The church will have a lot of arguments about, and still kind of has some arguments about, does God die? Can God really die? What does it mean for God to die? What is that Holy Saturday moment all about? And surely after the resurrection, so much of the sort of calumny directed at Christians who believed in the resurrection was that, oh, well, then, maybe Jesus just didn't really die, or maybe somebody just stole the body or something like that. So it's kind of fascinating to me. And one of the things I think about a lot in my work is about women and credibility, right? It's fascinating to me that these moments, the crucial moments of the Paschal mystery, are witnessed by women. And so the church believes what it believes because it believes the word of women. Women were the ones who saw him die. Women were the first to know that he was alive again, which I think is interesting in an era where believe women is kind of a controversial thing to say, because Christianity wouldn't exist if we didn't believe women.
That's such a great point. Um, Going back to the kind of theology around what it means to be an apostle. Yeah, we have the original 12, we have Paul. Are there any other people who we kind of officially, and then, of course, Mary Magdalene, are there any other people who we officially term apostles?
I don't think so. Like, there was whoever was elected to replace Judas in the 12, and I apologize that I don't know like who that is. I'm not a super Bible person, but no, I mean we kind of keep apostle biblically to that group and Mary Magdalene. We view the bishops as inheritors of the apostles because they share the good news. I think you can make an argument that anyone who is involved in the magisterium, and here I'm sort of elbowing some space for the theologians, anyone who shares the good news in that way, I think is also participating in a kind of apostolic activity. But in terms of Jesus's apostles, we have this group of 12, which is symbolic for reasons of the relationship between Christianity and Israel. 12 tribes, 12 apostles, and Paul, who is a great missionary who really sort of opens up Christianity to Gentiles, and Mary Magdalene, who's the sort of hinge without which the good news would not have been known, or at least without which we would not know the good news. Could God have done it a different way? Maybe, probably, but God didn't. So no, I mean, I think carrying the good news of the resurrection is the sine qua non of being called an apostle. So it's good to limit it. I think we can't call everybody an apostle because not everybody in the early church was an apostle. And I think it really behooves us as this current global institution to notice the diversity of ministries in the early church. And particularly, I mean, again, I realize I said you can't read too much into the Gospels because we don't understand it. And now here I go. But here I go. At a time when we're talking about how sacramental priesthood is being overtasked, right? We're asking these guys to do too much, to be the HR person, to be the finance person, to be the chief administrator, to be the person who administers all the sacraments, and to be the prime decision makers in the church. We have collapsed so many roles into one role. And so I don't want us to think about everybody as an apostle. I want us to think about the early church having a wide diversity of ministries that were interpreted in a wide diversity of ways. Apostles and catechists and widows and deacons, broadly conceived, so that then we can think about what are the ways in which we've lost touch with some of those roles, and how might those roles still be operating in the church today, but with different names. And I think it enables us to think about church governance in creative ways that don't all boil down to the sacramental priesthood.
So Catholic theology does link apostolic succession to the sacramental priesthood, which is limited to men. One of the arguments. Does thinking about a woman as an apostle disrupt this, whether it's Mary Magdalene or Mary, the mother of Jesus?
Yeah, it does. And it's good. We need to disrupt it. One of my favorite ecclesiology books, and it's accessible, anybody can read it, was recommended to me by one of my mentors, Father Dick McBrien of blessed memory. And it's Fred Swakowski's The Beginnings of the Church. And the opening chapter of that cautions Catholics especially, but really all Christians, against having a blueprint approach to Jesus's founding of the church, right? I think when we think about apostolic succession as an unbroken line, right, that you can look at the apostle James, the son of Zebedee, and then like trace who the current bishop is naive. And it presumes that Jesus founded the church in this blueprint sort of way. And so the blueprint approach basically says that Jesus had a plan all along for all of it, from the sort of every line of the Nicene Creed to the vestments that are worn at the Vatican on the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? Every single thing was mapped out by Jesus during his lifetime. And that's simply not possible, right? It's just not true. It doesn't mean that Jesus didn't found the church in word, in sacrament, in the real and symbolic meal that was the Last Supper. But we have to be very careful when we use terms like apostolic succession that we're not using them in such a literal way that we think that Jesus was some sort of Harry Potter figure that had, the ability to kind of guess or plan or plant the minuscule details of church governance before he, in his 3 years of ministry. I think that undermines Jesus's humanity, but also undermines our own collaboration in bringing about the reign of God, right? It undersells human participation in God's plan after Jesus. So yeah, I think limiting apostolic succession to the group of bishops that are in the Roman Catholic Church right now, it's non-ecumenical. It really overlooks the East. It, it leaves out a lot of the genuine diversity that exists in the church. And it flattens what I think is something that's far more intricate and beautiful than we sometimes see.
Yeah, sometimes the way people talk about that, it's almost sounds like they're talking about some kind of a mechanism, like a machine, where this lever goes to here. If you pull
Right.
this, it makes a priest.
Right. It's like, I don't know any human beings that work that way. Why would this one? And it's such a way of excusing ourselves too. Well, it's Jesus. This is something I argue with my students all the time, right? They're all Docetists. They're all like, well, it's Jesus. It's like, so you can never do it. Oh, so then we're all exempt from trying, right? It was Jesus. Jesus was God, blah, blah, blah. Well, Jesus was also a human being. If Jesus was just God in a meat suit, then none of this is worth it, right? Then there's no salvation. Then it's pointless. But we have agency because of God. And we, ironically, like Mary, we are called to put that agency at the service of God's reign. And that might look different for all of us, not necessarily because of our gender, but because of the constellation of things that make us human and unique humans. All of us have a responsibility to put that at the service of the reign of God.
So if we were to start talking about Mary as an apostle today, which sounds like you are pushing back somewhat against that idea, I guess what would be the pros and cons? What would the significance of that be?
Well, I think a pro is that we, if we were to do this, and I don't think that we should, but if we were, I think it broadens our understanding of apostolicity. What does it mean to be a bearer of the good news? Is it just women's reproductive capacity? If so, women have broad intellectual capacity. Women have broad organizational, political capacity. Women have communal capacity, just like men. Like all human beings have these capacities. And so broadening our understanding of apostolicity, right? What does it mean to bring the good news of the resurrection? Does it mean to form communities? Does it mean to accompany those who are oppressed and in fear for their lives, like Mary does at Pentecost? Okay, I like that, right? I like that broad vision of apostolicity. But again, on the negative side, I think that Mary's role as the God bearer, as the Theotokos, is significant enough, as the God rearer, right? The God nurturer, the God, the real sort of collaborator, co-conspirator with God is enough. I don't think she needs to be an apostle. I think the apostles can have their role, including Mary Magdalene in that group. And Mary can have her role, and all of us are called to have a role. And the work of our lives is to discern how we will all be co-conspirators with God.
So we always end these interviews by asking our guests if the listeners just take one thing away from this conversation, what would you want it to be?
I would want it to be that Mary's motherhood begins at Christmas, but continues in Jesus' life into Pentecost, and in our lives into the present. And that it is not a kind of sweet Hallmark Mother's Day motherhood. It is a motherhood that we see, unfortunately, on the news. That kind of bereaved, endangered, threatened, terrified, anxious motherhood. And so we're called to ask ourselves, what are we doing for the Marys in our country today, in our lives today, in our world today? And how can we help bring about the reign of God for and with them?
Well, this has been a really great conversation. Thanks again for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Rebecca. This was great.
I really wish you'd been able to join us for the conversation with Natalia, Emily, but I know you were able to listen afterwards. Was there anything in that discussion that surprised you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, everyone get your flu shot because the flu is no joke this year. But I think that something that surprised me was that right off the bat, she said, it's not necessarily a useful question to think of Mary as an apostle, and that not everyone has to be an apostle. And I kind of had this knee jerk reaction to that. And then as she continued on talking, you two talked about how we've simplified the church's role over time and that now we just have priest. But it used to be so much bigger. There used to be this bigger understanding of the people that were needed to build the church. And I was really compelled by that. I think the idea that we've gotten so bogged down in who a priest is and what a priest looks like, or a deacon, what are women's roles or lack thereof in this church hierarchy, and that we can leave that for a completely different time. But I do think that that has become the only role that matters. And I'm not saying that women shouldn't be in that role, but I'm saying that that lay people of various different jobs do have a really vital role in building the church. And I think her point that we've lost that was really resonated with me.
To be honest, that kind of surprised me too, because I sort of thought she was just going to pick up and run with the idea that, Mary brought Jesus into the world. Jesus' body and blood are in the world because of Mary. Therefore, we should think of Mary in terms of part of this apostolic succession. And I think that similarly to you, as she was conversing about this and laying out all of the different perspectives, I realized that we've really gotten comfortable with this hierarchical top-down vision of the church. And we envision like just this one dividing line, and you've got those who are in the hierarchy above the dividing line, and then all of the rest of us over here. And when we look at the stories of the early church, it's a lot more mixed up than that. Like all of these different characters are getting involved in different roles and arguing with each other and trying to figure out their place in the church. And it seems like what they're doing is really kind of enlarging it. And yet we've moved in the opposite direction, it seems, recently towards trying to kind of like narrow that have fewer roles, have all of the roles that we have in mind be more kind of authoritarian in structure. And I was also kind of like, well, maybe we should look at Mary from a different standpoint. I kind of traditionally always been annoyed at a lot of the conversation about women as mothers, even though I'm a mother myself. And there's this, like, even when people in the church talk about women who do not have children, they'll say things like, "Oh, well, spiritual mothers," or women are nurturing, women are mothers." And I'm just like, "Can we please give it a break?" Um, and I thought that the way Natalia talked about mothers gave me a whole different insight into it, especially when she was talking about looking at the mothers in the world today, the mothers who are grieving, who are living in fear for their children. And I thought, we maybe my objection to this focus on motherhood is partially because we've made motherhood itself so narrow and so fluffy and so honestly kind of weak.
Yeah, she had this good point that we do a decent job at talking about like the reality of Jesus or Mary's motherhood at the Nativity, and that we don't often talk about what that meant for the next 33 years, the reality of that, especially, to your point about being the mother of a son who was actively challenging empire and all of the emotions in the parenting that involved. And I was really glad that she pointed that out.
Like, can you imagine being the mother of Jesus? Your kid is out there doing this stuff, and on some level that your child is special. That the angel came and spoke to you, but now you didn't realize that that meant that they were going to be out there challenging empire, and you're like proud of them, but you're also like afraid for them, and it's just so intriguing to try and like even just a little bit put myself as a mother into Mary's shoes and try to think about what that must have been like. Was there anything else that you would have liked to have asked, especially if you'd been able to be in the conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you have something there about the anxiety inherent in motherhood. And so often I think we try to get rid of anxiety in the modern world, right? Like we explain it away or we treat it as something that needs to be treated. And I think that the two of your conversations made this really good point that like anxiety in Mary's life was a form of love and care and was the most appropriate way for her to parent adult Jesus at times. And I think there's something there about how we today treat anxiety, but also just like emotional labor in general. You don't hear about Joseph lying awake wondering if Jesus was going crazy or like if he needed to come home, right? I think there's just something there about these like gendered feelings or these gendered like ways of care for people that maybe we can reinterpret when you look at Mary's story.
Yeah, one of my most controversial opinions at this time of year is that the song "Mary, Did You Know" does not bother me, and a lot of Catholics dislike that song because they consider it to be like mansplaining to Mary, and they want to view Mary as already having known everything. And I feel like if we view Mary as already knowing, she's just kind of sitting there like nodding, like, "Yep, it's all going to be fine. I saw this coming." And that really separates her so much from the rest of us. It also kind of separates her from have this devotion to Mary, Mother of Sorrows, and the sword that pierced her heart. You know, if she's sitting there kind of like smiling placidly and like everything's going to be fine, there's not a sword piercing her heart. And it's one thing for her to have this kind of abstract awareness of who Jesus is going to be, but quite another thing to see that actually play out and to live with it and the sorrow and the fear that she went through. And I think that makes her a lot more relatable to us as women. To take that back to the question of whether she's an apostle or not, maybe it just opens up a whole different view on what a role can be in relation to Jesus and doing Jesus's work in the world.
Hmm.
So, if you were going to preach a sermon on this topic, what would that be?
Yeah, it's hard because I feel like Natalia answered so many other questions, and maybe the apostleship of Mary was not the right question at all. Because the sermon that I really want to preach is she had this line about the church believes what it believes because it believes in women. And just kind of pointing out, hammering home the idea that there wouldn't be a church if we didn't believe women. And I think there's a really powerful sermon in there because she's right. Today we don't believe women. And yet our very faith is foundational on the women who saw the empty tomb. So that would be my sermon.
I think I might actually, despite the fact that Natalia did kind of convince me to move a little bit more towards the side of no, Mary wasn't an apostle, I think I might still want to preach a sermon inviting people to reflect upon the possibility that maybe she was and what that would mean for us if we were to look at Mary as someone who went forth into the world bringing Jesus with her, and that's a role for not just women, but as you've mentioned before, for all of us to live out. And especially in this Christmas season, what does it mean to follow Mary and to birth Jesus and the gospel into the world? I think it's something that's a lot more, to tie into another of our previous discussions, a lot more revolutionary than a lot of folks want to admit. And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for this season of Glad You Asked and for our final 3-part section on Mary as a figure of liberation. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered next season on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And we hope you'll join us again in the spring for our next season of Glad You Asked.
Glad You Asked was made possible by the support of our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. The Claretian Missionaries in the United States and Canada are seeking young men who feel called to grow in their relationship with God and to serve others. To explore a vocation with the Claretian community, please visit myclaret.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Santa, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.